It's part 7 of our 10 Commandments series, and that means today we're talking about adultery. According to the Bible, any sexual thought or act that is at odds with the divine design is prohibited by the 7th commandment. We find that in Exodus 20, verse 14. It simply says this: "You must not commit adultery." Let's take a look at some statistics. How common is cheating in marriage in general? Men are more likely than women to cheat, 20% of men compared to 13% of women. Here's another stat. What percentage of married couples get divorced? Almost 50% of all marriages in the U.S. end in divorce. And actually, the stats for church-going people aren't really that different. And researchers estimate that 41% of all first marriages end in divorce. So the 7th commandment given thousands of years ago through Moses to the Israelites, it's still relevant today. Let's talk about it from the perspective of the New Testament. Sexual sin, according to Jesus, is everyone's problem. The 7th commandment is not just about the final act of adultery. It's actually also about lust in the heart. We get this from Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 5. In his Sermon on the Mount, verse 27, he says, "You have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery." Obviously, he's talking there about the 7th commandment. He says in verse 28, "But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So in case you thought that commandment 7 wasn't really for you, think again. If you're not married, according to this passage, you can still violate the 7th commandment. And even if you are married and you've been technically faithful, it doesn't mean that you've kept the spirit of the law in Jesus' eyes. Now, I think in today's culture, the most obvious application of verse 28 is pornography. Here's an alarming statistic related to that. 90% of teenagers and 96% of young adults say that porn is no big deal. In fact, in this demographic, they think that not recycling is a bigger problem than pornography. But that's not what Jesus says. In Mark 7, verse 20, he says, "It is what comes from inside that defiles you." So look at his list. "For from within, out of a person's heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder," and you can read the rest of the list for yourself. Now, the word for sexual immorality here is the word porneia. Sound familiar? It's where we get our modern word from, pornography. And it refers to any kind of sexual immorality, not just adultery. So porn is a big deal, and it's part of what the 7th commandment is talking about. But in marriage, here's what we need to know. We should pursue oneness if we're married. God's plan for marriage goes beyond avoiding an affair or a divorce. This biblical concept of oneness comes from Genesis chapter 2 with Adam and Eve. It says in verse 24, "This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one." God's intention for marriage is oneness. He wants a man and a woman to come together into a committed relationship for life. That's what marriage is when it comes to a biblical definition. Now, this concept certainly involves the idea of sexual intimacy, but it goes so much further than that. Oneness in marriage means that you love, enjoy, and serve your spouse even more. And when you begin to do that, it certainly has benefits in the bedroom. You're beginning to experience God's true purpose for marriage. It's not just about staying married forever. It's about having a fulfilling, Christ-centered marriage. That's really the heart of the 7th commandment. And one more thing, this is especially good for young people listening to this topic. Pursue sexual purity in your life before and after marriage. Purity isn't a destination, it's a journey. The truth is that none of us is pure. Think about Jesus' definition. We've all had lustful thoughts in our hearts. But the goal is to pursue purity every day of our lives, married or not. I love how Paul says it in 1 Corinthians 6. He says, "Run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality," there's that word again, "is a sin against your own body." Notice the action step here. He says, run from it. We should actively pursue purity. And again, this is true whether you're a preteen, a teenager, or whether you've been married for 30 years. So don't commit adultery. The 7th commandment means so much more than you might have thought.